Hello and welcome. I'm Bruce Vanderlaan, Managing Director of Mertz Taggart. We're a mergers and acquisitions advisory firm working in healthcare, primarily in home-based care, home health, hospice, and home care. I want to talk today about terms in a letter of intent that you should be aware of and be cautious of, things to look out for. So if you receive a letter of intent or you're in the process, there are a couple of things that are important enough to concentrate on to make sure that they're well understood and that you actually agree to them. First one I would want to talk about is the binding versus non-binding. So almost all letters of intent will say they're non-binding. Well, what does that mean? I remember as a young attorney many years ago, one of my first transactions, my client had signed a letter of intent, and then when it came time to negotiate the purchase agreement, it had gotten through due diligence, and now we're talking about the final terms for the transaction. And my client wanted to change one of the terms that had been in the letter of intent. And so as a young attorney, I went to a far more senior attorney, probably somebody who's the age I am now. But we wanted to change one of the terms, and that attorney said to me, well, you know, that was in the letter of intent, and that's what we'd agreed to in the letter of intent. And I said, well, yeah, but the letter of intent says it's non-binding, and so, you know, we want to change one of these terms. And the response to me was, well, I'm sure that your client wants the purchase price to be binding, and my client wants these other terms to be binding, even though the letter of intent at the time was not a contract, it was not a binding agreement. It's really a guide for where we want to go or where we want to get to when we negotiate the final purchase agreement. So it makes a lot of sense, and that's one of the things that you want to be aware of. The letter of intent itself is not a contract, it's not binding, but when you do get through due diligence and you do get to the purchase agreement stage, those terms are going to be the guide for what the terms are going to be in the purchase agreement. And it can work both ways. I've certainly had situations where I've been on the other side and said, well, that's either not what it says in the letter of intent, or that is what it says in the letter of intent. So let's go with what we've already agreed to. You want to be sure that when you're taking that binding versus non-binding forward, that you understand all of the terms of the letter of intent, so that when it does become a binding agreement and you're finalizing those terms, that you have agreed to those terms, that that's what you wanted in the beginning, because that's what you're going to get in the end. One of those terms very often is GAAP, GAAP, and you'll see it often. It'll be all caps. GAAP stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. When it comes to closely held businesses, businesses that are owned by an individual or a couple or family, maybe a couple of partners, very rarely do I see those businesses adhering to GAAP standards for accounting. It's the gold standard. It's the standard that publicly traded companies and a lot of financial buyers, private equity groups will use. But when it comes to closely held companies, for them, for the most part, their concern is taxes. And so tax standards are used, which are not the same. They're perfectly valid accounting principles, but they're not the same as GAAP principles. And so I will almost always try to strike that term and insert the term that is actually used by the business, whether it's cash-based or tax standards for accounting, because you're making representation. Again, it's a term that you're agreeing to at the time of the LOI, and it's going to feed into that purchase agreement down the road. So we want to make sure that we're talking about the proper, the accurate standards that you're following, because you're promising to the buyer that that's what you're doing. The next one would be net working capital. Net working capital is a concept that a lot of people have difficulty with, and I'll admit that, you know, when I first encountered it, I had difficulty with it as well. It's classically, it is current assets minus current liabilities. So the major ones that we'd be talking about on the current asset side would be accounts receivable. The major one on the accounts payable side would be payroll. So essentially, you can think of it in terms of your accounts receivable minus your accounts payable is going to be the amount that's going to be left in the business at the time of closing. Sellers often say, well, we earned that. That's our money. You know, we'll pay, of course, the payables up through the date of closing, but everything that we earned prior to that time, that should go to us. And buyers will say, well, that's all true, but you run the business by that formula, by having those accounts receivable cover those accounts payable, and then having that money, those funds available to continue operating the business. Otherwise, if you had to dip into cash month after month, it wouldn't last very long. So what we try to do is we try to define the target net working capital, and we try to land in the middle. We look for a period of time, generally saying the previous 12 months, that we can define what would the target be, and we find a nice middle ground and get agreement on that's the target for closing. And then when we get to closing, we look at what it's going to be. So if the number, let's say that the target number is $55,000 for an average net working capital month over month, we get to closing and we say, what's going to be the net result of that formula, the current assets minus current liabilities. If it's, say it's $60,000, then we're going to gross up the purchase price by $5,000. If it's $50,000, looks like it's going to be the net calculation result, then we're going to gross down the purchase price by that $5,000 because it would be $50,000. And so that extra, there'd have to be an extra $5,000 in cash left in the business. And, you know, not understandably, that would cause many sellers to say, wait a minute, that's my money. The classic way of thinking about net working capital is to think about selling a used vehicle. If you're going to sell a used vehicle, you got to leave some gas in the tank because it's got to get off of your property, right? So sellers really typically want to leave just enough gas in the tank to get to the gas station on the corner. Buyers, of course, want the tank to be full. They want to drive as far as they can with the gas that's in the tank of the vehicle that they're buying. So what we try to do with net working capital is similar to what you try to do with the gas. You leave a reasonable amount of gas in the tank for the vehicle to be driven away and to meet its purposes. And that's really net working capital. The final one that I want to talk about is an earnout, or sometimes today called contingent equity. And it's something that I actually disfavor, many advisors disfavor, because you're not getting the cash at closing. You're running the risk of what may happen and whether or not you'll receive that earnout, that contingent equity. So when you're looking at it, when you're discussing if that's a term, you really want to concentrate on how you're going to get that contingent equity or that earnout. And you need to establish the formula in a way that reduces your risk, because you're not going to be in control anymore. The buyer's going to come in and could potentially change the business, could potentially have a negative effect on referral sources, for example, or employees. And so that could negatively impact the bottom line, could negatively impact how you earn that earnout or that contingent equity. So those are terms you want to be well aware of and have thought out and try to really kind of game out so you understand what the risk is and how to solve for that risk. And it can mean an increase in the price, or it can mean decoupling the payout from the performance if it's something that happens that's unforeseeable or not your fault. So really, those are some of the key terms that I like to look at and discuss with my clients when we're looking at the letter of intent prior to signing it and engaging then in the due diligence that's going to take a couple, 3 months to get down the road to when you're going to negotiate over that final purchase agreement and the enterprise value and the purchase price. If you have any further questions, or you'd just like to talk about any of these terms or other terms, please feel free to email me, Bruce at Mertz Taggart, MERTZTAGGART.com, or give me a call on my cell phone, 239-220-3326. Thank you.